So welcome to week 3. I just have a few announcements before we begin tonight, and we're going to make a special effort to have at least a half an hour for students to be able to ask questions, because the last few times we've been kind of cut short in that, and I'd like to have ample opportunity for that. Next Tuesday, I'll be here on campus from noon to 5. And that would be an opportunity for any of you who is working on a paper to come and talk to me about what you'd like to write about. Or if you just want to come and talk with me, that's okay too. But I would appreciate it if you would email me, however, and let me know that you plan to do that. And then I will let you know where we'll meet, okay? I've just been in communication with the Religious Studies Department, and we're trying to find a little kind of closet for me to hang out in. So anyway, that's next Tuesday from noon to 5. Those of you who are going for 1 or 2 units, it's not too late, or too early, I should say, for you to think about what your first paper might be. I gave you a prompt on the syllabus, but you don't have to stick with that. You can write about anything that you might like that really catches your fancy. It's 5 to 8 pages. I'm not going to be checking for Chicago manual style, you know, and these things. These are, yeah. This is more along the lines of a reflection. But if you'd like to move into something fairly seriously, I can help you do that too. This coming Sunday, I will be here from about noon until 1:30, right after the 10:30 a.m. Mass at the Coho patio area there. And there is a sign up here.
We can send it around.
We can send it around.
Here's a pen.
And here's a pen. Thank you, Nancy. This is, if you sign this, it's not an obligation exactly. I'm not going to mark you off if you don't show up. But it would help me to know if you intend to come. It would be very helpful. And if you don't sign it and still want to come, you can come too. But it would just give me an idea of how many people to prepare for, so we can pass this around. And I think that is about it. I am going to be posting on the course website a paper by Father George Kennard, who is not here tonight, but he is registered as a Stanford continuing studies student. He's an elderly Jesuit who lives up in Los Gatos. He's incredible. He's still so physically fit. He rides his bike down the hill to Santa Clara. This is really something else. And he's back in Chestnut Hill tonight giving a paper. Anyway, he has written a paper on the kind of the semantics of Vatican II, the way language is used as a way of interpreting the council. Now, this is, I have to tell you, not going to be the approach to the council that everybody is going to necessarily appreciate. He's kind of a linguistic analyst, so his philosophical approach is pretty special. But I'm going to post it anyway, and you might find it kind of interesting to see what Father Kennard has to say about all of this. Okay, I promised my friends that I would not speak too long. So I'm not going to spend tonight introducing to you Lumen Gentium, and instead I'm going to introduce to you our speaker, Professor Gary Macy, whom I know very well. I could probably do this one by heart. Yeah, but anyway, he's my boss. Okay. So Professor Gary Macy is the John Nobili, S.J., Professor of Theology at Santa Clara University and Chair of the Religious Studies Department. He received both his bachelor's and his master's degrees from Marquette University, where he specialized in historical and sacramental theology. And he earned his doctoral degree in divinity from Cambridge University. He is the author of several books and articles on the theology and history of the Eucharist, Christian symbol and ritual, and ordination, in particular ordination of women in the history of the church. Professor Macy was Herodotus Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and Senior Luce Fellow at the National Humanities Center in North Carolina. He is also a beloved department chair who is leading the department, the graduate program in pastoral ministries at Santa Clara at the same time. He also has belonged to several professional organizations, but one of them that I find most intriguing is that he has been on the board of and plenary speaker for the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians in the United States, ACTUS, even though he himself is not Hispanic. As department chair, he's also ultimately responsible for fulfilling Santa Clara's education, UNSU, right? Of deacons for the Diocese of San Jose and now Monterey. So these deacons, and that's kind of apropos of tonight's topic, are receiving their theological education at Santa Clara. So he brings real-world experience with the diaconate and deacon training to his thinking on this topic, as well, of course, as deep erudition in the history of the church. And I will introduce our other speakers after the break, Sister Gloria Jones, who some of you probably know already, and Deacon John Kerrigan, whom some of you probably know already as well. But we'll wait until after the break for those introductions. Are there any questions before we move on? Okay? All right, good. Gary?
So I'm going to talk tonight, or rather discuss with you tonight, not only, well, first of all, the reform of ordained ministry. I think that's the most interesting and central question when one studies this particular document in Vatican II, one of the most interesting questions, and that will lead us into the discussion of ordination of women. And I've done quite a lot of research on that. That's a whole another area. But since it's about Vatican II, we should start with Vatican II. Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on the Church, is one of the most interesting and one of the more revolutionary of the documents to come out of Vatican II. The theologian who was probably most influential behind the writing of this doctrine was Yves Congar, who had written a lot on the Church. He's an amazing historian and scholar, but also wrote quite a bit on the laity. He wrote famously on the laity before the council and got in trouble for that. Well, by the time of the council, he had become one of the experts to which people turned at the council. So there are actually 5 different topics taken up in the document, and the last is on Mary. So I'm not going to talk about the topic on Mary. And so I picked out some of the most important parts of this document. First of all, for the first time in a long, long time, the council very carefully wrote a statement on the Church, describing it as subsisting in the Catholic Church. Now, the reason why they did that is because they wanted to say that the Church is more than Catholicism. So that there are people from other Christian groups that are certainly also part of the Church. And that was a hard-fought verb there, subsists. All right? Because there were people who did not want to say that. So this document opened up the possibility that there were people who were in the Church but not Roman Catholic. So that's the first opening up, and it's a pretty amazing opening up. The second, I think, is even more interesting because it then opens up the question of the Church even wider. And that is a quote from the Council: "At all times and in every race, God has given welcome to whosoever fears him and does what is right." So now we're talking about the Church as all good people. The real Church is made up of all good people, whether they're religious or not religious, or whatever religion they belong to. Now, I want to stop there just for a minute. Where is Congar and where is the Church getting this from? You know, why would they write something like that that seems so revolutionary? Actually, it's not revolutionary at all. They're quoting Augustine here. All right? Augustine described the church as every good person who ever lived from the time of Abel. In fact, one of Congar's books is called that in Latin, Ecclesia ab Abel, the church from the time of Abel on. So it was in the early church, in the early writings of the church, and in the medieval church, it was almost taken for granted that the real church, the church in God's eyes, if you like, is made up of every single good person who's ever lived, anyone trying to do the will of God. All right? So this was the recovery of an older tradition, a very important older tradition. All right? And Congar wasn't the only one who was responsible for that. Karl Rahner wrote quite a bit on this as well, and they're all drawing on the retrieval of older theologies that saw this as very central. So although this was a real opening up of the church in the Second Vatican Council, it was also a return to the original sources. Moving on for that, another important area that they wrote about was the governance of the church. And this was called a collegial approach to government. And the document says that the governing of the church belongs to the College of the Bishops along with the Pope, not the Pope alone. And there was even call in the document for a synod of bishops that would govern with the Pope. That's not happened. All right. Archbishop John Quinn gave us a little talk about his new book that's coming out May 1st, his new book on reform. And he's very clear that he was very clear to us that the council called for that kind of a synod to co-govern, but that it hasn't happened yet, as he put it. It hasn't happened yet. So it was really revolutionary in that regard. We can talk more about that a little bit later, whether that was revolutionary, how revolutionary that was. But again, this is based on past history. And then finally, there was a strong statement about the laity also being part of the priesthood of the church. Laity are not just members in the church, but they share in the priesthood of the church. And that's pure Congar. Congar wrote a huge book about 10 years before this on the role of the laity and the importance of the laity. So this is the setting of the document that we're going to look at tonight. This is just a brief summary of the document and some of the highlights from the document. Paul?
I just think it's important to note that Congar was a Dominican.
I was going to say.
Oh, yes, of course. Yay, okay. All right. Yes, of course he was a Dominican. I can't believe I didn't say that right away. Now, tonight I want to focus in, now that you've got the general framework, I want to focus in on one particular passage in Lumen Gentium. And this is the one that reintroduces the permanent diaconate. All right? Deacons who receive the imposition of hands not unto the priesthood, but unto service. Deacons, permanent deacons, are not priests. They're not lesser priests. They don't want to, the ones I talk to, they don't want to be priests. That's not their vocation. They're not priests. It's very hard for people to get that out of their head. They're not priests. A lot of the work that work I'll be referring to tonight, it was done by William Deitwig, who's now in the Diocese of Monterey, but he's probably the best historian of Vatican II and of the diaconate. And also, little known fact, we went to high school together. I know, how strange is that? And in our high school, there were 130 students in the high school, not in our graduating class. So it's amazing that we would wind up working in a similar area. So we're going to focus in on that. And of course, it had been centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries since there had been a permanent diaconate. So why all of a sudden in Vatican II do they want to restore that? It's not moving. Not going to the next slide.
Try a little arrow down there.
Yeah, I did it. Worked the other time. Okay, hang on. I can do it. How's that? I did it.
Try these.
I did. It didn't work. Thanks, Paul. I got it, though. Okay. So there was a strong call for a renewed a new ordained ministry that would work closer to the people. Now, a lot of the push came out of World War II, when they realized that lay people were taking over more and more jobs from the clergy because there just weren't clergy there. And they said, what a great vocation. So why don't we bring this back? What a great service to the church. Now, that's not the only thing that was going on. There was also a movement in Germany in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and that became a movement called the Caritas movement, and it was mandated for every diocese in Germany, and it was for lay people to work more closely with the priests and the bishops. And then, of course, World War II. A lot of the Polish and German priests who were incarcerated in the concentration camps saw the good work that lay people were doing to keep the faith alive. And they said, we've got to continue this. Now, when they actually met in the council, there is a kind of a legend, a rumor that goes around that it was the Third World bishops that really pushed for a renewed diaconate. That's not true. It was mostly the European, especially Eastern European bishops. But there were a lot of bishops who pushed for it. There were 101 proposals in favor of the renewal of the permanent diaconate before the council that were brought to the council in the preparatory phase of the council. 2 of the proposals specifically desired a diaconate open to women. So at the time, they raised that question already, whether the diaconate should be open to women. When the debate actually took place, 45 bishops, speaking in behalf of 795 of the bishops, spoke in favor of a permanent diaconate. So 795 in favor. 25 speakers, representing only 82 fathers, spoke against the idea. So 746 in favor and 82 against. The debate was held from October 4th to October 16th in 1963. These are the 2 men who probably spearheaded the movement: Cardinal Julius Döpfner and Cardinal Leo Sunens. Döpfner, in his intervention, asked the famous question, why should these people be denied the grace of the sacrament? They are already doing the work of deacons. Why should they not be ordained, since they're already doing the job? He said, yes, and he argued that they should be married. He said, yes, there's a value to clerical celibacy, but the ordained life should take not new forms. We should restore old forms of clerical life in the 20th century. Sunens was one of the most eloquent of the advocates, and he had good reason for doing so. He became acting rector of the University of Louvain when the Nazis arrested the incumbent, and he served with great courage and integrity throughout the war, and was eventually placed on a Nazi execution list. And he was just saved from being killed by the Allied liberation of Belgium in 1944. So he really wanted to see this restored diaconate for all of the reasons that the other bishops in World War II did, because they saw the laity taking over more and more important roles when there just weren't priests. He goes, this is a vocation that we need to foster. This is an ordo we need to restore, a function we need to restore. And Sunens had the brilliant idea of saying, okay, because he could see there were people uneasy with this whole idea, right? Married men, maybe even women, a new order in the church. What do we do about this? So he said, okay, I'm not asking you to restore deacons everywhere. He said, but there are some of us who want deacons, so why don't you just pass a law saying, for those bishops who want it, you can have it. Now, Bill Deitwig tells me that this is a very good way to get things done with bishops. You don't say, That's what he's, you don't mandate that everybody has to do the same thing, but allow those who want to do it to do it. So that passed, and it passed as an experiment for, I don't remember, 10 years or whatever, and then at the end of 10 years they said, the experiment's working, we're going to continue. So this is a trick, by the way, that works really well in academia too. Let's just try a trial project, a pilot project, which means you got the nose of the camel is under the tent and you're done. You just passed it. Okay, so this worked. All right, that particular approach worked, and it passed, as you know. So this is a second confirmation. There's two documents that talk about the permanent diaconate, and this is the second one in the mission activity of the church. And here you can see where Sunans intervene. This is, you can see where it works. Where Episcopal conferences deem it opportune, not everywhere, you might not want it as bishop, but somebody else might. So you shouldn't stop them from doing it if they want to do it. Okay, so and there we have preaching, presiding over scattered Christian communities. You can see the influence of World War II, of course, and practicing charity and social relief work, which is the main service of a deacon. Deacons are servants, that's the word means in Greek, and that's what they originally did in the early church. All right. And then, of course, they also have a sacramental job to perform. So this describes more closely what the bishops actually passed. Oh, that's right, I can't push that button, nothing happens. Come on, there we go. So what do deacons, what are the important points in the Lumen Gentium's and the Council's teaching on the permanent diaconate? First of all, it's not the presbyterate. Permanent deacons are not little priests. They're not on their way to be priests. They're not called to be priests. It's not their vocation to be priests. They're not priests. Yes?
So what do they call the priests now that are, you know, they are deacons first and then become priests? So do they...
The transitional diaconate.
They're a transitional deacon. Okay, thank you.
Transitional diaconate. There are now less of those than there are the permanent deacons, I think. Pretty sure. Yeah. There's just over 3,000 seminarians, so I can't imagine there's too many deacons in the United States. I mean, I know there's more deacons than that in the United States. Deacons can be married. That was a big decision by the council. And the diaconate has a separate charism. They have a separate job to do, a separate function. They are to be the servants. They are to do social work and to assist the priest at the altar, of course, but that's not their main function. And they're careful to say that this is a new expression of an older ministry. As an historian, and I've been researching and writing history for 40 years now. History, as far as I know, there's very, very few times that history ever repeats itself. It really doesn't repeat itself. When you revive an older custom, it's always in a new context, so it always is different. So this is too. In fact, the only thing that I can be that's pretty sure where history did repeat itself is when mullet haircuts came back, because they were very popular in the 12th century among the Normans, and that did come back, sadly. Okay, but otherwise it just doesn't really happen much. Okay, and the deacon actually reports to the bishop. Now, sometimes you have situations where often deacons are tied to a particular parish, but actually the idea was that the deacon would work with the bishop, not with the parish priest. So their boss should be the bishop, not the parish priest. And the deacon is a servant within the servant church. So the deacon is to model Christ as insofar as Christ was a servant. Okay, that's the idea of a deacon. Different than that of a priest. So what? Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about how revolutionary this was, even though it was the restoration of an older custom in the church. So, most important thing here, Now you have two ordained orders in the church. Before Vatican II, between roughly the 11th century and Vatican II, you had one ordained order in the church, just priests. Okay, there were deacons, these transitional deacons, but you were a deacon for a year or so, and then you became a priest. Bishop's not a separate order. All right? You just had the priesthood. And now you have another order that's not the priesthood. Oh, you don't find that as interesting as I do, but that's because that's because the idea that priests are the only order is itself a new idea, relatively new idea in Christianity. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about what ordination used to be before the Gregorian reforms, the reforms of the 11th century. And I'll talk a little bit about that reform movement too. Yes, Paul?
I have one question, because in the pre-Vatican II church, weren't there ordinations to other things like subdeacon and lector and acolyte? And
No, but those weren't real ordinations.
those are not real ordinations?
They are not in that church, no.
What are they?
They're steps on the way to being a priest.
Oh, okay.
I mean, the whole idea is it's a trajectory.
Not an ordinatio.
Because there's not permanent subdeacons, there's not permanent lectors, there's not...
Gary,
Yeah.
you were installed as a reader or whatever, installation.
Yeah. You were.
Thanks, Ann.
You were. Okay. But before the 11th century, 'twas not so. Before the 11th century, the word ordo, ordinatio in Latin was a very common everyday word. It didn't have a special religious function to it. Okay? It was a word that you used when you put anything in order. Anything at all. Okay? So if those are ordained books because they're in alphabetical order. If you put your books in order, you just ordained them. That's exactly the word you use in Latin. This is an ordination of your books. It's putting anything in order is to ordinare them. Something that is in order is ordained. Now, we don't use the word like that anymore, but in Latin you do all the time. I mean, it's a very common everyday word in Latin. So when you said something was ordained, it didn't mean necessarily special. It meant it had a particular function, it had a particular place, it had a particular role. That's all it meant. Okay? So, for instance, in feudal society, in medieval society, they would often talk about there being three orders: cleric, knight, and peasant. Those are the three orders. There they are in a manuscript. Right? And especially in the Roman Empire, everybody had to belong to a particular ordo. And it even determined what clothes you wore. Certain ordos would wear certain clothes, certain roles, certain functions, certain status in society. So it makes perfect sense that when Christians began to organize themselves, that's the term they used in Latin. And what it meant is that you had a particular role or a particular function in the community. So all of these, bishops, priests, deacons, male deacons and female deacons, subdeacons, porters, lectors, exorcists, acolytes, canons, abbots, abbesses, kings, queens, and empresses, were all ordained. And if you go back to the old liturgy books from that time, you'll see an ordination ceremony for an empress, ordination ceremony for the king when kings were crowned. It was called an ordination. If you look at the Rule of Benedict, the words that they use for picking an abbot and installing an abbot are the ordination of an abbot. That's the actual chapter heading. Ordinatio abbatis, ordination of an abbot. Right? Why? Because these are different roles in the community. If you got married, you went to a different role in the community, a different relationship to the community, and they talked about that as ordination as well. And they were all equally ordained. If you were ordained an abbess, you weren't less ordained than a priest or a bishop. Yes?
But this was not a sacrament.
Well,
Is this a sacrament of holy orders?
yes, as it existed at the time.
Had the sacrament of holy orders?
Well, you see, during this time period, they hadn't worked out all of that theology. So, yes, I guess, because that's all there was.
So when did holy orders get figured
when they worked out a theology of sacraments, sacramentum, boy, that's a whole nother issue. Very interesting one, though, I must say. That was during the same time period.
So in medieval time.
Well, during this period of Gregorian reform. That's when they began to work that out. But even there, it's very difficult because the word sacramentum in Latin has a broad meaning, and it means symbol, it means ritual. You know? So it can mean a lot of things. One of the great writers on Christian sacraments, one of the most beautiful writers, I think, is Hugh of St. Victor in the 12th century. And he said, do you like Hugh of St. Victor?
I've heard of him.
Oh, he's a beautiful, beautiful writer. And he said there are two great sacraments in Christianity, creation and redemption, because both of them symbolize God to us. So the word was used not in a real technical sense. Yes?
But isn't it true that what we recognize today as the seven sacraments is relatively historically recent in terms of actual dogmatic teaching about that? It takes us to the Council of Trent.
Council of Trent, right. So the 16th century. Yeah, right. Yes, that's true. It makes it very hard to translate that word in Latin. In fact, the one thing you cannot translate the word sacramentum into in English is sacrament, because that doesn't work very well. Yes?
In which category sisters or nuns are?
They're ordained. They are ordained too. So if you go back to the old ritual books, there'll be a ritual, or the ordination of a widow or a nun, or, yeah, they're called ordained. Sanctimonialium is the word they most usually use, holy woman.
It just strikes me that one of the ways you can understand this is in saying that each of the ordinations is sufficient unto itself. And it's kind of an Aristotelian ordering of reality that would lead to that kind of a conclusion. Doesn't mean that there still aren't hierarchies in society, that bishops, for example, aren't at the top and so forth. But it does mean that each of these persons unto herself or himself is ordered to that state in life, and that there are rites and rituals to declare that so.
Yes, but a bishop, even though a bishop had more power, would not be more ordained than a deacon.
No, right.
In fact, you did not have to be a priest to be a bishop. Yes.
Then with congars, the laity are part of the royal priesthood, does that put them on the same level as an ordained priest or bishop, or?
No, not quite. But they share in the same priesthood, is the way he would say it.
Equal to.
Yes. Okay. Now you'll notice here that in this particular world, almost everybody has some ordo. Everybody has some ordo or function. All right. So what they have in mind here is a society, a church society, that's organized around function and not power. Now, that's not pure function. I was talking about, again, we had this great discussion with Archbishop Quinn and Bishop McGrath and Bishop Garcia, and we were talking about this, and Bishop Quinn made the really good point. He said, well, it's not pure function, Gary, because they picked a person who had that charism, who had that, it was also the person that mattered. And of course, he's quite right. So, but what I mean by a function is that the community would pick you to do a particular job, all right? And it had to be the community that picked you. And then they would have a ceremony where you were installed into that job. But you were installed into that job only for that community. You couldn't be a priest in another community. You couldn't be a bishop in another community. You could only you only served within the community that you came out of. The Council of Nicaea calls a bishop moving to another diocese adultery. This is your people. You don't go work with another person. One of the first popes who was a bishop somewhere else, Formosus, and then became Bishop of Rome, was later tried. Now, it was a put-up job, okay? It was a political trial, all right. But one of the things they tried him for is the fact that he had been a bishop somewhere else. You can't do that. So they cut off 3 of his fingers and threw him in the Tiber. He didn't care. He was already dead. They'd dug them up to have the trial. It's a medieval thing. Yes, yes.
How many bishops were elected who weren't priests, and
Yes.
were women ever elected a bishop? Sorry.
No, that's a great question. And the answer to your first question is lots of bishops. Pope Leo the Great was never a priest. Pope Gregory the Great was never the priest. Ambrose of Milan, St. Ambrose, was never a priest. Because you just moved, they'd pick the person in the community who was the best for the job. There wasn't a little, there wasn't a kind of path you followed. It's called the cursus honorum now, the path of honor, but there wasn't anything like that. And the deacons were so important in the Roman Church that they would pick people who had done a really good job as deacon and make them bishop, and that's especially the case with Gregory, but also the case with Leo. Ambrose of Milan wasn't a deacon either. Ambrose of Milan was chosen by his community to be the bishop before he was baptized. So they had to baptize him quick and make him bishop in a weekend. But he was just obviously the best person for the job. He was a catechumen. And they said, that's the guy we want. Now you'll notice also it's communities who pick their bishops. That was true until 1917. I know. Yes?
So when the Vatican picks bishops and sends them across the country to some other diocese, they're forcing them into adultery.
Yeah, that has been said. Well, things have changed since the time of Nicaea. But I'm trying to just give you what the original understanding was. That changes in the 11th century. But in the original understanding, yeah. Now, I mean, there were bishops who sometimes moved, but often that would be for political reasons. People weren't crazy about it. Or another community really did want that person. But it was very rare. Because you were supposed to be, this was all supposed to be coming out of, flowing out of the community you belonged to. And you also didn't have a power that you could take with you anywhere you went. No. Yes?
The deacons could be married, but could priests and bishops be married?
Absolutely.
And have children?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Wow. There was this wonderful letter that was written by Sidonius, one of the bishops in the 5th century in Gaul in France. And they wrote to him, another diocese did, and said, give us an idea, you're a very wise man, what should we look for in a bishop? He said, well, someone who's brought their children up well, so you can see how they're going to do. Okay. Somebody whose wife might be the daughter of a bishop, so she knows what the job is. And he said, and for God's sake, don't get one of those monks, because they haven't a clue as what they're doing.
Tell us that before.
How come I didn't tell you that before?
This is important.
Oh, I don't know.
2 slides earlier.
I don't know. I was just kind of focusing in on this. Yes?
It looks like in the United States that the job of a local ordinary, a local bishop, is largely administrative.
Yes.
Overseeing lots of departments and employees, and it looks like a branch manager of a company. And it looks like oftentimes, I'm from the Diocese of Beaumont, Texas.
Yeah.
When a bishop is appointed there, it's assumed that he's only going to be there about 5 years or so if he's good. If he shows promise and is good at his job, he's probably going to go to Tulsa, or he's going to go to somewhere, almost like the farm system in baseball.
Yeah, and that's, of course, a very...
It just looks like if you're good at your job on a small level, you move to a larger place where you kind of... When did that kind of thinking come into the praxis?
Wow, I would say that's 20th century.
It's a little earlier than that, but it's modern. It's
modern,
right.
Yeah.
Partly because they're just, the bishops were selected, certainly in Europe and in the colonies, from the local churches.
And is that just an American or North American thing, or is that happening all over the world?
No.
All over the world now.
All over the world, yeah.
All over the world now. Yeah. But it is really recent, within 150 years. It's a very recent thing. Yes, sir?
How much do you think might be connected to the emphasis that we were talking about Vatican II, of looking at the whole church as one community? In just terms of looking at things as normal.
Oh, I see. Yes. The question is, how much do you think this was influenced by Vatican II's thinking about the whole church, the universal church, as one community? So you really can't go outside the community. okay, when you get moved around. Well, certainly that's part of the thinking. That's part of it. But I think that's a later form of thinking. It's not what they were thinking in the 11th century when they started this. But yeah. And I've actually heard that said. So, okay. So, that is the understanding of ordination. So, that all changed during the Gregorian Reform movement, or the 11th century Reform movement. It's named after this man, Gregory VII. Gregory VII was the first deacon who was elected pope that insisted he be ordained priest before he became bishop. He's a monk. He was a monk. All right? So what happens, and of course this doesn't happen overnight, this takes about 100 years all to work out. Real ordination was reduced just to the priesthood, and the diaconate was a stepping stone on the way to the priesthood. All right. So you see, what Vatican II did was very different. They restored the older understanding to some extent of ordination, by having now not just one order, but two permanent orders. That's a step back to the older understanding. The ordination gave a person a power. Once you ordained, you could consecrate the bread and wine anywhere, anytime. It gave you a power, whereas you wouldn't have had that before. And that's the power you get. I mean, they were very clear about that. Now, this is interesting, too. It's the 11th century Reform movement that introduces celibacy into the clergy. That was a tough fight. That took about 100 years. All right? And celibacy, you may know this, you may not. Okay, how many people in here are married? Okay, the rest of you are celibate. I mean, I don't care about your personal life, but I'm telling you you're celibate. Because technically, celibacy just means you're not married. In fact, it means you can't get married. All right? So diocesan priests and bishops don't take any vows at all. They don't take vows of chastity. Religious orders do. Priests don't. But there's a law that says any marriage they contract is invalid. And that's what happened in the 11th century. They passed a law saying no marriage that they contracted could be valid. Well, that took them right out of the marriage market. I mean, there weren't a lot of parents who wanted their daughter to marry somebody when the marriage wasn't going to take and the kids couldn't inherit. And yes?
Just to back up a step, what was the previous thinking regarding the power of consecration either among deacons or priests before they received?
Oh, the consecration of the bread and wine? There was a big debate in the 12th century whether anyone could consecrate the bread and wine or just a priest. And some argued that anyone who said the words of consecration consecrated, no matter who they were. There was another debate over what exactly affected the consecration. Was it the words? Was it the sign of the cross? Was it the Holy Spirit? There were a number of different theories. So they're working this all out at the same time. Before that, I don't think they thought about it much. As Edvard Skilebecks, the great Dominican theologian, said, the leader of the community led the liturgy because he was the leader of the community, or she was the leader of the community. Okay? It wasn't because you led the liturgy, you were the leader of the community. It was vice versa. So they wouldn't have thought about it in the same way. Does that make sense? Okay, good. Yes?
Should remind you, no matter how many Dominicans you mention here, you're employed by the Jesuits.
True.
Was there backlash against the Gregorian Reform movement?
Sorry?
What kind of backlash was there against these new reforms?
Well, there were, of course, a lot of clergy who didn't want to become unmarried. There were a lot of wives who didn't all of a sudden want, and didn't, sometimes they were just thrown out. And people thought that was very cruel. They said celibacy would not work. A lot of people said celibacy would not work. And later on, I'll talk about one theologian and his wife who argued in favor of the older form of ordination and said it was traditional, we shouldn't change it, but, didn't happen. Yes?
In terms of number 6, you've indicated that there were various ordinations that women could
Yes, there were.
Why did they specifically at this point say that's all over with?
You know, I don't know for sure.
That's not documented.
Oh, they give a lot of reasons, but why did they change their mind? I mean, I don't know. Well, I take, in my book, I took some guesses at why it might have happened at that time. But I don't really know for sure, because they could have gone on having women be celibate, but also continuing on as deacons, for instance.
So
but they didn't.
You...
Oh dear, we're getting way off the track here. Well, several things. What's that?
We'll give you extra time.
Oh, okay. Several things, I think. The rediscovery of Aristotle and his natural history, that is to say his biology, which was very demeaning to women. Okay. Every woman is a mistaken male. All right. Secondly, once, well, this is the saddest part for me. One of the arguments that they used to enforce celibacy was that women were stupid, dirty, evil creatures. And you wouldn't want to be married to one anyway. This is the beginning, unfortunately, of one of the most misogynist periods in the history of the church. And I think it's related to that. I think it had to do with the feudal system, and one scholar has a theory who I respect a great deal and said that there were extremely powerful women and there was a backlash. I don't know. I don't know because it didn't have to happen, but it certainly did happen. That's my time up.
You have a grace period.
Okay.
But
Were there any popes that were married?
After the 11th century?
After the 11th century. No. Not after the 11th century. No, not married. Yes. Oh, yes. They certainly had children.
During the 11th century, also there was the emergence of kind of moral categories. I mean, this is the same time you got the emergence of sodomy, for example. And Peter Damian.
Damien.
So
terrible,
I'm not saying that these two are equated, but the emergence of new moral categories within which to, in a certain sense, cast people.
Yes, it's very true.
It's beginning to happen during this kind of a time.
Yeah, all of that's true.
Ontological states of being a woman or being a male or being a sodomite, all of that was fairly new.
That's very true. That's very true. It was new. Now, what is the history I gave you about Vatican II and the history I gave you about the period before the Gregorian reform movements? So what does that mean for women? Well, Vatican II has reversed the Gregorian reform claims. Now we know there are at least 2 ordained states, so we could have more ordained states again. All right? We're moving a bit back towards maybe a situation where ordination means you're picked by a community to serve a community. Maybe this is a first step in that direction. Now, what would that mean? This would mean that there are now 2 ordained positions that might possibly be open to women. One, but only one, is definitely forbidden to women. All the documents saying women can't be priests say women can't be priests. None of them say women can't be deacons. And that's been deliberately left open as a question by the Vatican. They have not decided that yet, whether women can be deacons or not. Because the diaconate's not the priesthood, all of the arguments against women being priests don't apply. They simply don't apply. You say, but the Pope said women can't be priests because of X. Whoop, back up. We're not saying they should be priests. We're saying they should be deacons. Yes?
Could you speak a little bit about Cardinal Cosper's critique that women can be deaconesses, but not deacons, and it's probably
Right, yes, that's a very good point. Recently, Cardinal Walter Kaspar has said, yes, we can have women who are not ordained, but consecrated as deaconesses, so not quite fully woman deacons. That's because he reads the history of the diaconate for women differently than I would. All right, and I know a scholar that I respect very much, Sister, I can't remember. It'll come to me in a minute. Names go out of my head. I know that's horrible for an historian, but they do. She also argues that, so he's basing that on her research. And let me tell you, the evidence for women deacons is really pretty overwhelming, but then when you try to find out what exactly they did, it's tough to find out. There's a lot of evidence that they were there. It's hard to find out exactly what they did. Sometimes they're treated exactly in the same way as male deacons. So for instance, in one of the 8th century books of ordination rites, it just says, a prayer for the ordaining of a male or a female deacon. Boom, same thing. Other times, you read longer, I have some descriptions if we have time, longer descriptions of the ordination of a woman deacon, and it's quite different from that of a male. But similar enough, you know, they get a stole, and the stole is for preaching, and, you know, similar enough that, so that's the argument. He would argue that the evidence shows that, yes, there were women deacons, but they were never the equivalent of male deacons. I would say that there's evidence both ways. The historical argument is not definitive, I would say. But it never would be definitive. I mean, the church does stuff that we've never done before. So what, you know? We don't have to have done it before. And boy, have we done a lot of things we never want to do again. Wow, okay, we had a crusade, so let's have another crusade. No, we don't want to do that. Okay? So that's not going to be the definitive argument. But especially in the West, the information is difficult to read. So it is possible that women could be ordained to the diaconate. That is still an open question. And this is a summary, in the summary of a long study done, and I think Sister Gloria might say something more about this, so I'll leave it. The Canon Law Society did a study of whether women could be ordained, and they say sure, and it wouldn't be tough to do, basically. Okay, I'm trying not to, well, I'm allowing questions now, I guess that's okay. Yes, sir. 5 minutes, okay, yes.
You mentioned a moment ago that there are 2 ordained positions now, the deacon and the priest. Now, how about the bishop? Isn't that a 3rd?
No, a bishop is not a new ordained state. It's a priest. Yeah, it's consecrated but not ordained. What's about? Sorry?
How about married priests?
Oh dear. Yeah, well, celibacy is a law that they can dispense you from. It's not a vow. Yeah, I know. Yes.
Yeah, but there's quite a few married Roman Catholic priests.
Yes, in the Eastern Rite, yeah.
No.
Oh, you mean the
Roman Catholic priests.
Well,
the Episcopalians that came over?
Oh, yes,
and
right.
They can't get married if their wife dies.
Well, they can give them a dispensation from the law, basically. Okay, I want to look at some, very quickly, I got 5 minutes. Paul told me I have 5 minutes. So here are some deacons, women deacons. There's only one person in the entire New Testament who's called a deacon. Only one, Phoebe. And she's a woman. That's the only person in the entire New Testament who's called a deacon. This is it. This, oh gosh, Olympias, incredibly powerful woman who was a deacon and very involved with some of the best theologians of her time. I don't mean involved, but, you know, corresponded with and so on. Also, Anastasia wrote 4 letters to the Bishop of Antioch about the interpretation of Scripture. These are very famous deacons, women deacons in the early church. This is a very famous woman deacon in the medieval church, early medieval church, Radegund, who was a queen in Gaul, and then had the bishop ordain her a deacon, ran away from her husband. And what I like about this, I know I have got 5 minutes, what's really cool, that's really her desk. Well, I guess just historians get excited about that. But we really have her desk. That was her little portable writing desk, and you flip up the top. Never mind. I just, you know, when you actually have stuff from the period, it gets us all excited. All right. And then finally, another deacon is Eloise, the wife of Abelard, the theologian. She calls herself a deacon. He calls her a deacon. This is in the 12th century. They were about the last to defend the older understanding of ordination, to argue that women could be ordained. And then here is an interesting 12th century manuscript book. And Mary is dressed exactly like a deacon. And that's exactly how a deacon would have been dressed if she was on her way to be ordained. See, she has her stole, and it's tucked under her robe until she's ordained. And then when she's ordained, she takes it out. And it's the same stole that they give deacons and priests and bishops for preaching, called an horarium. Same exact stole, okay? That's all it's ever used for. She also has a veil, which a 12th century deacon would have. And my interpretation of this is that she is, as all deacons do, is going to bring forth the word of God. And so this is her ordination as a deacon, who will then bring forth the word of God. I think it's really quite lovely. All right. And then, so to sum up, women have been ordained as deacons. Vatican II allows for the order of deacons separate from that of the priest. Women have not been forbade from this order, so when are we going to do this? So it's something we can really do. That's it. I went over. I'm so sorry.
Okay, everyone. We're going to have now a couple of responses to Professor Macy's presentation, and then that will be followed by opportunity for questions and answers and commentary and so forth. When you do ask a question, I will repeat the question for the sake of the videotaping that's going on, because this is going on to our website. So our first respondent is Sister Gloria Marie Jones, whom some of you may remember because she was on staff here at the Catholic community at Stanford for a while. She is now the congregational prioress of the Dominican Sisters of Mission San Jose, not too far from here. It's an international community of sisters with members in Germany, Mexico, Guatemala, and the United States. And she's been actively engaged on the national and local levels in the National Religious Vocation Conference, the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, and the Dominican Leadership Conference. And as I say, she was also on the staff here for quite some time, and she's about to take off to Rome to attend an international meeting of religious superiors, which she might tell us something about. John Kerrigan is a friend of mine and ours, as well as the Stanford community. John is a deacon of the Diocese of San Jose and an alumnus of Boston College. He's also the chief investment officer at Santa Clara University and is responsible for the management of our endowment. Prior to joining the university in 2002, he spent over 20 years on Wall Street in various sales, product, and client-related roles in the US and Japan. Since 2005, he's been director and trustee of BlackRock's iShares funds, a $450 billion exchange-traded fund complex. And he's a chartered financial analyst and chairs the board of directors of the BASIC Fund, Bay Area Scholarships for Inner City Children, and is a trustee of Sacred Heart Schools in Atherton. He was also on the board of directors at the Jesuit School of Theology for some time. He's a good example of a deacon who brings real-life practical experience into the heart of the church. So welcome to both of you. Thank you. Sister Gloria?
Okay, I'm going to do a little building on what Gary began with. And as he mentioned, the church has not said women cannot be deacons. The sacred congregation for the doctrine of the faith in this important document on the question of the admission of women to the ministerial priesthood, published in 1976, made a very important statement. And it said that it was not ready to take a stand related to women being ordained as a deacon. And in fact, it was an area that needed more study in the church before a decision would be made. And then, as Gary made reference, the Canon Law Society of America, in 20 years later, we're moving along, 1995, had a formal approval of a study that they engaged in, 3-year study, and along this question, could women be ordained deacons? And Gary made reference to that. The result of the study is really this 53-page booklet. And an interesting thing about this is that in 1995, when it was published, it was selling for $7. I went on Amazon.com to try and get a copy recently, like a few weeks ago, and it is on sale now for $472.81, excuse me. There are only 2 copies available of this document, which either it's a hot item or they've been burned. I don't know which. The result is of this study that the ordination of women to the permanent diaconate is possible and may even be desirable for the United States in the present cultural circumstances. Now, because it's so hard to get a hold of, I did make copies of the conclusion and the points that are the basis of their decision, and they're up here if you want it afterwards. You're welcome to have it's well defined.
How much are you charging?
I know, I could be making some money, huh? A question I want to ask is, why is it important for women to be ordained deacons? Is this just another manifestation of, radical feminism? Or could this be an authentic movement of the Spirit in the church in our time? And I would like to propose that the ordination of women to the diaconate is important for the sake of the church, not for the sake of women. Women do not need this as much as the church needs this. As I looked at the question, I find myself drawn towards one of Cardinal Suen's insights that Gary also made reference to, and I want to repeat it because it's so important. The church is entitled to all of the grace the Holy Spirit provides. It is important not to close off any means by which the grace of God might flow into the church. We shouldn't close off any means. And I would suggest that women as well as men are means through which the grace of God flows into our church. If I had time, I would focus on 4 areas that relate to the appropriateness of women's ordination: Jesus' own actions, the diaconate and the role of women in the church, the grace of the sacrament of orders, and my experience as a daughter of a deacon, and my experience as a consecrated woman religious. Now, I have 7 minutes, so I can't do that, but if you want to ask me any questions about any of those areas afterwards, I'm happy to answer them, okay? I want to just say a word about 2 of them. And one is Jesus' own actions, because that's often cited as what did Jesus do related to ordinations. So what did he do? The call of the deacon mirrors the whole of Jesus' ministry. Jesus sent forth his apostles and disciples to be engaged in proclaiming the good news, baptizing, healing, washing feet. we see concretely in Scripture both men and women engaged in this call, even though women are largely invisible due to the cultural circumstances of the times. So it's not any accident. In fact, it's astounding that Jesus, after the resurrection, chose women to proclaim the truth of his resurrection to the apostles. I mean, he could have asked Peter or John. I mean, he could have appeared to them first and said, spread the word, but he didn't. He chose women as the ones he revealed the resurrection to and said, go and tell the apostles, go and tell the disciples. All four Gospels note this. And Luke names the women as Mary of Magdala, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, along with other women. So this wasn't a singular person. The church calls Mary of Magdala the apostle to the apostles. So if we have any doubt about women being capable of proclaiming the good news of the gospel, we have only to remember Jesus' own actions. And secondly, let's briefly jump to today, the diaconate and the role of women in the church. The Council Fathers, as has been noted, recognized the church's need for a new form of ordained ministry that modeled Jesus the servant. To this end, the permanent diaconate was restored, as we've heard. So the diaconate can be called the sacrament of the church, for deacons symbolize and make present the call of all Christians to be people of the word, people of charity and service, people who preach Jesus Christ, and as St. Francis said, at all times and when you need to use words. So according to papal teaching, deacons are meant to animate the church's own service, and they offer a particular grace for the church. And that's important. It's a unique grace that reminds us that the church exists for the service of humanity. That's what the deacon's life proclaims, something to which Pope Francis is giving such powerful witness during this past month. So, in truth, the deacon's life is meant to give testimony to the heart of our very identity as baptized Christians. Because our identity as baptized Christians is to be of service, male and female. So why cut off half of the population from giving witness to that truth that is a call to all of us? Since that's true, I suggest that both women and men should give this witness. And Pope John Paul II spoke of the importance of the church breathing from both of its lungs. And he named the lungs the male and female dimension of life. And for the church to be healthy, he said, it needs to breathe from both of its lungs. So a question is could this not be an avenue that the church can give witness to that in our age? And what would that mean to the church if we did? Furthermore, it's a historical fact that the suppression of women deacons in the church, as we saw in that 12th century or so, that at that time, women's permanent dedication to lives of service and the service of charity became assumed by consecrated women religious. So we stopped having women deacons, and active religious consecrated women started growing more and more. And they took over those roles of charity, of service, preaching the word, and of proclaiming the gospel. So another question might be, as the number of women religious is waning today, could it be that this grace is meant to be restored among the church through women deacons? And that can be another avenue of this moving forward. Through the years, women have been critically important ministers of diaconia, the Greek word for service. In fact, women have carried a large percentage of the lay leadership and ministry roles in the church in the areas of catechetical ministry, liturgical ministry, pastoral ministry, ministry to the sick, all ministries appropriate to the diaconate role. So as Cardinal Döpfner raised the question, why deny those who are serving in diaconal roles the grace of the sacrament? I think my time's up.
We'll keep listening to you.
Could I say one sentence? I'll just give my conclusion. My life history and the history of the church, I do believe, gives witness to the fact that both women and men have unique grace to bring to this church of ours and to this role. And my hope for the church is that we continue to create space and ways that will allow the gifts and the grace of all members of the church, whether their culture, their age, or their gender. That's my hope. Thank you.
I have a question now. Why can't the religious communities, the Carmelites, Franciscans, Dominicans, raise up within their community deacons like they do the abbots or the abbesses?
Do you think we could hold that?
Yeah, hold that question. And
we have a number of questions that we want to entertain, but we'd like to hear from John first. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks, Sister Gloria. And we agreed when we had a brief chat last week that we would take different roles, and we thought it made sense that I would talk about my vocation to the diaconate, and maybe at the risk of repeating some of the things that have been said, talk about the function and the identity of the deacon, although I think there'll be themes worthy of repetition, and then ask a few open questions, maybe a couple of provocative ones, to put the question of the diaconate and women's ordination to the diaconate into a larger context, and then we'll have questions. So I have to confess that I found my vocation to the diaconate on the Stanford golf course. And I say that because back in 2005 and 2006, I played golf about 3 or 4 times a year with Ron Hansen, who I know many of you know. Ron is a professor, the Gerard Manley Hopkins Professor of English down at Santa Clara University. Many of you are probably familiar with some of his nonfiction work. Great writer. And over the course of walking the course and playing, we would talk about his deacon formation program. He was in the formation program back then, and he talked about his own whys and wherefores and the nature of the program and what his plans were. And that had kind of planted some seeds in my mind. And by the way, I should say that when I say that I play golf, I score in the 250s. Okay, so I mean, I go out on the golf course.
You play at golf.
Yeah, I play at golf, yes. But prior to talking with Ron about the diaconate, my experience of deacons was pretty limited. I mean, I'd read about it. It was kind of an interesting curiosity. In terms of actual exposure, it was really just deacons who were assigned to my mother's parish back in Queens in New York. And they were 2 perfectly nice and capable individuals, but there was nothing about what they did or said that caused me to say, wow, I really want to be a deacon. What ultimately triggered my decision after these conversations with Ron and thinking about it was a combination of heart and head, and I have to say it was in that order, heart over head, to witness in a very specific way. as Paul mentioned, I'm on a number of boards. I was on the finance committee here at Stanford long before I thought about being a deacon. I don't need more tasks in my life. I don't think many of us do. We've got plenty to do. But the notion of witnessing in a particular way struck me as something that that could be helpful in kind of living in the Spirit and sharing the Spirit. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. The other thing I want to mention is women's role in the formation of deacons. It's kind of a miscellaneous note, but I think it's important to mention, especially because Ann Gritz is here, because Ann was primarily responsible for my formation and my fellow deacons' formation in that 2008 to 2012 period. I was ordained last May. And it's the role of deacons' wives. My wife, Elizabeth, is an attorney by training, and she came to all the weekend seminars and the retreats and all the other activities. And Sister Gloria, you may know this from your mother and father's experience. And at one point she said, "Now, John, you supported me through law school, but you didn't have to go to classes with me. You didn't have to take the bar." I mean, wives of deacons kind of do everything but get ordained. So just a sort of side note. And again, I think the importance of having wives involved in the process is laudatory, but there's a significant investment on the part of one's spouse and one's family. Very briefly, I know it's been alluded to, but I think it's important to say what deacons do, and I'll give the elevator speech version. Again, Gary used the word, and Sister used the word word, and that refers to proclaiming the gospel, preaching, and teaching in the name of the church. Pretty straightforward. Gary used the word liturgy before, or sacramentally. Deacons baptize and lead the community in prayer, witness marriages, conduct wakes and funeral services. In fact, this past Saturday, I presided at a funeral for the father of a friend of mine who passed away. And as a minister of charity, deacons identify the needs of others and then try to marshal the resources of the church to address them. So many deacons are involved in detention ministry. In fact, I think that's probably the single most common form of diaconal service, because that's an area where there are really great needs and not all that many people who are willing to consistently work in that area. I guess I also want to just say a couple of words about how those functions have translated into my role here at Stanford. I serve as deacon and preach about every 5 weeks. When I preach, people have told me it's the best 8-minute nap they've ever had in public. And I help at baptisms and will help with weddings as schedule and opportunities occur in the next few months, and as I mentioned, funerals. I'm also, another part of my diaconal role is I'm involved in the ESTEAM program here. ESTEAM stands for Engaging Students to Enliven the Ecclesial Mission, which is why we call it ESTEAM. And that's a national organization. We work with students. We've got 25 students involved in the program, a number of whom are here this evening. Ranging from freshmen to postdoctoral fellows. And the idea behind ESTEAM is to prepare people theologically, spiritually, and with leadership and group effectiveness skills to raise their hand to serve in the church, both now and especially after graduation, to go out to parishes and have had enough training and enough confidence to be able to serve on finance councils and do youth ministry and parish councils, or to do entrepreneurial things in the church that for which there aren't formal roles. So that's been a great activity. In fact, one alumnus of last year's ESTEAM program from the business school is now working with the Archdiocese, volunteering with the Archdiocese of Chicago, helping them in business planning and strategic planning, and is adding a lot of value. So again, it's a national organization. So getting back to this role of witness and my role as a deacon, what I found over the past year is that being a deacon, and I'm sure you find this as a Jesuit and as a priest, and Dominican and as a priest or as sisters, it becomes a Rorschach test for people's questions and issues about the church. And in my experience, that has been all positive. It has been people saying, what are you doing this deacon thing for? And it becomes an angle of entry for having conversations, especially with men, conversations that they don't have with anyone else. And so it becomes a way of taking a deeper dive into subjects around spirituality, doubt, maybe life issues that I consider to be a real privilege. It's not to say you certainly couldn't do that as a, as a layperson or in a different state, but there is something about this status, if you will, that seems to invite people into a conversation. And so, tantum quantum. If it's, if it works and it's good, then use it. The other thing I want to underscore is something that was mentioned a couple of times, but I think is really important because it's the diaconal role, I think as Sister Gloria had underscored, is not simply a matter of function. It's not simply a matter of preaching at Mass or being involved in the esteem program or presiding at weddings or funerals, that it really is something that is very much tied in with the recovery on the part of the Church, particularly at Vatican II, of seeing the Church in its servant role in the world. And that mindset was not always thus. Maybe Gary could talk about that later on. So the reason why the diaconate was rejuvenated was not because of shortage of priests per se. It wasn't because of the functions. It was that the Church really wanted to make a statement about deacons being a permanent sacrament of the Church's diaconal or service nature. Pope Paul VI said that the diaconate is a driving force of the Church's diaconia, service, and the sacrament of the Lord Christ himself, who came to be served, who came to serve, not to be served, who came not to be served, but to serve. Sorry. And Pope John Paul II put it this way: deacons are meant to be living signs of the servanthood of Christ's Church. So it's this identity piece that I think is of equal or greater importance to the function. I think that Gary's work and Bill Deitwig's work, which you had the opportunity to read from that chapter in the book, and then Phyllis Sagano, who is the co-author of the book that Gary and Bill Deitwig wrote, I think they make a very compelling and a very well-documented case for why the question of women being ordained to the diaconate should be pursued. And I also think that their research and tonight's presentation and discussion, I think, underscores that the Church's teachings have changed and continue to change over time. So we're part of a Church that can and cannot change. And I think that is a constructive point to note, that throughout these discussions that the Church is sometimes vigorous, sometimes sclerotic, but it tries to answer questions with new and old answers. So I think the phrase that you might have used, Gary, before was a new expression of an old ministry. And Sister, you mentioned the Canon Law Society of America and some of the other documents. So it's an evolution. I personally, and often we as Americans, like things to happen a lot faster, but I think I have to say that this is meaningful progress. I hadn't known, in my research, I didn't see anything about Vatican II mentioning women being deacons. You mentioned that 2 out of the 100 or so bishops and cardinals had proposed that. It's obviously become front and center over the past 5 or 10 years. Again, I would call that progress. And finally, what I'd like to do is put the question of ordaining women to the diaconate into a larger context of evangelization. I fear that we have lost, or we risk losing, a generation of Catholics in terms of their specific belief and practice in the Catholic faith. And while obviously women's ordination to the diaconate doesn't have to be exclusive to, or mutually exclusive with ordaining women to the diaconate, I think that my question would be, would this be something that would be in the service of evangelizing young people? I guess that's kind of a mission-critical activity in my book. And if it is, it's something we should pursue vigorously, because I think that's the critical function. I think the final point is, and this is beyond the scope of tonight's discussion, but I think it's important to mention, is that I think the future of the Church, and especially the Church in this country, at least, it depends on the sharing of authority between clergy and the laity, quite separate and distinct from discussions around women being involved, women or men being ordained as clergy in the form of deacons. That clergy and laity are both called to serve the church and the world, and that call comes in the form of their baptism. And I think that's what grounds their common mission in the church and in the world. Again, it's a separate discussion, but I think the true empowerment of laymen and laywomen, of which ordination of women to the diaconate is a part or a subset, I think that's what I would call, kind of in business lingo, one of the critical success factors for the realization of the vision of Vatican II.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, and if I could just add one tiny thought, and that it's that if we could allow what you were talking about, of the call to come from the charism of the individual, the gifts of the individual, and not focus on are they male or female, but if this individual person holds the gifts that are needed for the community, and can, bless the community with those gifts, then let's call that person to ministry and not make it defined what sex are they first, or gender, or whatever.
Okay.
Anyway.
So I guess we're going to questions
Thank
now.
you very much.
Okay,
Yes.
good.
So like to limit the questions at the beginning to students. We want to hear from the students. This is an opportunity for you. And then we can extend it beyond as, how much time do we have?
It's 8:38.
Okay, good. So questions from the students. This can be undergraduates or Stanford Continuing Studies. And your name, please? David. Okay, David.
So we've heard a lot of reasons for women being able to be in the diaconate. Are there any compelling reasons against it?
Are there any compelling reasons against women being in the diaconate?
Well, I wouldn't call this compelling, but I would not be surprised if one of the resistances to ordaining women to the diaconate is, if they're ordained to that, then will it not, the next step not be, priesthood, the presbyter. So I think there's a fear in that.
Where does the fear lie?
Those who would not want to allow women to have that power and that call in the church.
Gary?
Yeah, the two arguments that I've heard, aside from the argument that you just gave, Sister Gloria, are first of all that the historical evidence is not definitive enough that women deacons were the same as male deacons. And the second argument is that even the permanent diaconate, to some extent, participates in the ordained priesthood, and since women can't be ordained priests, they can't be ordained deacons. Those are the arguments I've heard.
Although so much turns on what you mean by participating in the priesthood, right?
Oh, yes, it's not a,
right.
it's tricky.
Right. This is where we need more work. Yes, sir.
My name's John.
John.
What would be the difference between a sister and a woman deacon?
The difference between a sister and a woman deacon?
I shouldn't, maybe it's my lack of knowledge of what sisters do, but...
Well, there are powers a deacon has that a sister can't witness a marriage, usually. Some of the sacramental called to serve at the altar in some points. There's canonical ability to be a single judge, in the legal world of the church. I mean, that's an area that, but we don't receive the sacrament of orders. And the sacrament of orders actually creates an ontological change or alteration in the individual that makes them serve in the person of Christ in their service. And that doesn't happen. We don't receive we're not a sacrament as a woman religious, consecrated religious.
Thank you.
Yes. Your name again, please? Elisa, okay.
This was
can sort of piggyback off of the first question. So toward the very end of your question, you mentioned like women and men having unique grace. And I would think that that would be evidence for a separation, if you would, especially between like priests and nuns, them having a unique grace, therefore serving in very different roles. So can you talk about how were women to serve as deacons in the same role as men, how that unique grace would fit in?
I have to rephrase the question for the microphone. So the question is, if men and women are each given a unique grace, then how does that affect? How would that affect, play out, let's say, if women were ordained deacons?
You know,
speak to that.
Women bring a particular way of looking at things that is just distinct. We know that from psyche and, you know, so the female and the male psyche. In witnessing with my mother and her being trained through my father's diaconate program, when they would do baptisms, my father had the power to baptize the child. My mother brought a whole nother gift to that experience of sensitivity, of awareness, of engagement that my father didn't have. You know, I think in the preaching, I do believe women can break open the Word with perspectives that men just might not have. And it's not always black and white, men have it and women, I mean, it's not, but it's just, it allows another, our life experience that shapes us creates new insight into who is God, where is God, what is the Word of God telling us? And there's 50% of the population that might hear things in a different way through a woman's voice, or feel identified with God in new ways.
Yes, your name, please.
First,
well, no, you were first, and then him.
I'm Megan.
Megan, okay, Megan.
I am not Catholic, and in our religion, we recently had a policy change that allowed women where men were traditionally only allowed, and there was an overwhelming response of women that took a hold of this new privilege. What do you anticipate would be the response of women if the diaconate was suddenly open to them? Or what would you hope that it would be? We had a lot of varying ages, young women especially, just in the thousands come forward. I just want to hear what your vision is.
What would be the response, what would be your vision of the response of women, especially younger women, to the possibility of women being ordained to the diaconate?
Yeah. I think that's what, John, you were referring to at the end in view of the evangelization. You know, I don't know, but I would hope that it would give a whole group of young people or women feeling a place in the church in a new way and a value in the church.
I can understand that.
Yes, I think that one of the interesting things that's happened in the church since Vatican II is that the ministry of the church has changed from being ordained ministry to a lay ministry. So 80% of all of the ministries in dioceses and parishes in the United States are done by lay people, and of that 80% were women. So I imagine that there would be quite an interesting response. It'd also be interesting if, I mean, that is a huge change that's happened already. You know, some people say, well, eventually it'll be the age of the laity. No, that already happened. Yeah. That's a done deal. That change is over. The question is now, what are we going to do about it? So there's a lot of women who are already doing the job. They'd just be recognized as doing the job.
Couple of things.
No, go ahead.
One is, if we have the time, I'd love to turn that question around to people in the audience who.
What would you think?
From your experience, is it big deal, so what, or wow, this is great? One sort of small point is that in the United States, and I think this varies by countries, the criteria for men applying to and being accepted into the diaconate right now is to quote, mature men, and what they mean by that is of an age, I think it's above 35, and if you look at the reality of deacons in the United States, the average age is probably more in the 50s or kind of post-retirement ages. So at least from a sort of nitpicking standpoint, if the change were to occur, I guess the question would be, would the criteria around age change as well. And again, part of that is a practical consideration. I don't think that people under 35 are not mature. Obviously, it's that people tend to have families and children and jobs and a lot of responsibilities as their careers and lives go like this. And I mean, it's like any other job or role. It's time consuming, and there's sensitivity around not wanting to overwhelm someone.
Thank you. Yes, what's your name, please?
Thomas.
Thomas.
Going back to every Augustine statement that every good from from Avalon is part of the church, does it require knowledge that you are following the will of God to be considered a good person, or would it open up the possibility for a righteous atheist to still be able to go to heaven?
This is with reference to the point that Professor Macy made earlier, where Congar was saying that, and one of the ancient teachings attributed to Augustine was that every good person was included within the ambit of the church. Does this mean that a righteous atheist or somebody like that would be included? Is explicit knowledge somehow also required?
I think that an atheist would be included, and I'm basing my answer on a recent essay that was written by a graduate student, won the essay contest for one of the theological societies, where the person argued that if you had a particular understanding of God that was very negative, and you had a very understanding even of Christianity that was very negative, then following righteousness, goodness to the best of your ability would require you not believing in God and not believing in Christianity. And in that sense, a person like that would be doing to the best of their ability what was true and beautiful and good. Does that make any sense? I mean, if you have an idea of a very vengeful God,
This was actually a live question in the early church.
Yes, it was.
I mean, we're talking about the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries when conversions were the mode of the day, all the way up until the time of Augustine, actually. I mean, he was part of that whole movement. But what people were asking, well, what about our pagan ancestors? Have they somehow been included within the graces of the Paschal mystery, the death and the saving death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, simply because they had not heard of him? And there were a number of different theories put forth by the fathers to account for the saving work of Jesus Christ extending to people who had lived before Jesus.
Virgil.
Such as implicit faith, for example, fides implicita, which did not require obviously explicit knowledge, but called for a way of life that was ultimately directed in its finality toward what was revealed by God in Jesus Christ. And then there were a number of other theories as well, baptism by desire, for example. But especially implicit faith, and that became the basis for a lot of thinking about this in the 20th century, especially. A century when atheism, in particular, became quite widespread and culturally embedded, and sanctioned by, say, Soviet regimes and so forth. What do you do about that? And that's when some theologians started going back to the sources and developing theologies perhaps more in the language of our time, the parlance of our time, such as Rahner, for example. Are there any questions on this side that I'm missing, Ben?
If you don't mind, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the concept of ordination of bishops, because 2 reasons. One, I've heard people, like I've seen commentaries essentially complaining about the lack, how we don't use the word consecration for bishop that frequently anymore, or at least I've never heard it. And then there's, I'm pretty sure in one of the assigned readings for this lecture, there was a comment on how Vatican II took the number of orders from 1, the priesthood, to 3, the diaconate, the priesthood, and the bishop, and the episcopate.
There was a huge debate for centuries over whether bishops were a separate order or not. I was under the impression it was decided that they were not a separate order, So I'm not sure where that would have been in the readings.
I'm not sure which article that was either, but I can say this, that for about 10 to 15 years after the council, it was common to speak of the three modes of participation in holy orders. And I believe it was in Deitwig's article too, where he points out that in the late 80s and up into the 90s, and certainly now, there was a development in the thinking there. So that by the second edition of the Catechism, for example, you no longer have that kind of theology. So this is a really good example, I think, of a theological development that happened but very rapidly in the church. We're talking about in the last 40 years, up to 10 years ago. Because when the council ended, I think what you're pointing out was a fairly common way of talking about it. But now we don't.
It was in the readings, because I remember it very specifically.
No.
Okay, I didn't.
Must have been in Bill's. Probably Deitwig.
But there's a question over here. Yes, and what is your name, please?
My name's Annabeth.
Annabeth, okay.
Yes. So my question is kind of, because this discussion about the ordination to the deaconate is focused on the idea of men and women, and I was wondering how critical the idea of a rigid gender binary is to Catholicism, and whether it's possible to, in future, move away from this to something that there's no more binary, to something where sex is equated with gender, so that it's inclusive of transgender and cisgender people, binary and non-binary identified.
So what are the chances of our moving beyond gender binaries in Roman Catholicism?
I think that would be a really important move. And I think theologians are doing that now. Let's see. So first of all, let me say I think that would be a huge improvement. I think that would be a really intelligent move. Okay. The problem is that, so, given that, what are the obstacles? Well, the obstacles, I think, are a traditional form of language, which many people, of course, are dealing with. Say, how can we move beyond traditional forms of language to have more inclusive language in Scripture and liturgy and so on? And then also, and this is an idea that is worth pursuing, we need to move away from a Neoplatonic framework of thought, a Neoplatonic epistemology and a Neoplatonic metaphysics, where things have essential entities and are eternal. That is happening, but a lot of religious language, particularly in Roman Catholicism, but also in other forms of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, have that inheritance, which makes it harder to move away from hard and fast categories.
Okay, yes.
Yes.
And what's your name, please?
Margaret.
Margaret, that's right, yeah.
In response to that, how do you incorporate all of theology of the body into that response?
Yes, how do you incorporate theology of the body into that response about transcending binaries? You're talking about John Paul II's theology of the body.
Oh, there for a minute I said, well, people come in all different kinds of bodies. First you had me there. You had me there. I'm not familiar enough with John Paul II's theology of the body. I'm just not. So.
I think it's incompatible with John Paul II's theology of the body, because his theology of the body, which is not the teaching of the church, by the way, was his theology, but nevertheless, it does very much rest upon metaphysical renderings of male and female that are eternally inscribed, right? And so there's no way, according to that theology, that you could make room for a view that would not take gender into account, much less transcending the binary. So I think there you're looking at quite frankly, as I would see it, a kind of an irreconcilable conflict, right? So perhaps there's a third way, a via media, that we could find.
Yeah, and I mean, are we in this process of growing in a state of consciousness that perhaps we'll catch up with it someday? Paul's words about in the body of Christ there is neither male or female, slave or free, we are all one. And if you look at where we've come to from the image of women, back in the Middle Ages, we're making progress. But We have a ways to go.
And I think what you made a very good point, Sister Gloria, which is that when we talk about issues of ordination, in one sense, it's not completely the case, but in one sense, it isn't about women, or it's certainly not about men, but it's about the gifts that God has called forth for God's church, you know? And in a certain way, that gets us out of the binary right there, but in a way that's really theologically, you know, authentic, orthodox, I guess you could say. And it's also rooted in that idea that it's by virtue of our baptism, which you were pointing out, John. It's by virtue of our baptism that we are one in Christ Jesus. It has nothing to do, ultimately, with whether we are male or female, much less whether we are ordained or not. And those are the kinds of things that, in certain ways, the latter part of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st are kind of bringing to the fore in our consciousness again, I think. Some elements of the tradition reemerge as others become maybe less prominent over time. John, okay, wait a minute. We've already asked a question, Jonathan, so we have two guys back here. Connor, I didn't mean Jonathan, I meant, what's your name? Yes, Connor.
This is more, I guess, church political question here.
No.
What do you think the circumstances need to be for this to occur, for women to be included in the diaconate? Because in terms of talking, in my experience, it seems to have significant momentum in North America. But has Pope Francis had come out and had a position in any of his previous works, or is there a coalition of possible cardinals that may be forming within the church to support this?
Yeah, there is. There seems to be evidence that there is exactly that. And however, because let's see, it's going to be done quietly, because if it's done in if the media picks it up, it'll kill it. You know, because the opposition that exists will just be adamant. However, if it's done slowly and cautiously, it might actually happen. And yes, there are cardinals who are in favor of it, and I think the one who's most obviously is Cardinal George in Chicago. So there are people who would like to see this happen. So there's other indications that it's a live question, that it's a serious question, and that there is momentum for it to change. I would also mention that, I mean, when I was talking about how much the church depends on women to run in the United States, I think as there are more pastoral associates, is that the correct term? Lay people who run parishes in the absence of any priest?
Administrators or something.
Yeah, they're whatever that term is.
Directors of parish life.
Directors of parish life. As there are more and more of those, and more of those are women, it'll become harder and harder not to give them some official recognition above what they already have. Especially if they've been there, as a friend of mine has, in Amsterdam for 12 years.
Okay, we have time for one more question, I'm afraid. You just heard the bell, it's 9 o'clock, so this is a bonus question. Jonathan, I'm going to have to pass you over, okay? Next time. Yes, because I want people who haven't been heard from yet, each person, right? Okay, what's your name?
I'm Scott.
Scott, okay.
You talk about wanting to get young people more involved in the church, or feeling like people are frustrated, and I think that a lot of young people really are. And I think a large part of that is a pretty ubiquitous feeling that the time scale where 40 years is a very rapid theological development is pretty frustrating for us. Is there any evidence of increasing momentum post-Vatican II?
For you too, huh?
You know, I would just say, I hope in the Spirit, I believe the Spirit is still at work. And I think Pope Francis is a perfect example of that. So I'm just saying, let's keep hoping that the Spirit is going to pick things up and move them along. And I truly join you in hoping it can speed up, because we need it.
I'd like to throw one more thing. I'd like to throw it back at you and say, you know, Ignatius of Loyola, Francis of Assisi, Dominic, they didn't wait for change. They got together with their roommates in their college dorms and they just did it. And they didn't ask for permission or anything. They made up entirely new things that had never been done before and just started doing them. Some of them were successes and some of them were failures. But to wait for change to happen is maybe too passive. Just throw it back at you.
Yeah. I would just say that, I mean, again, being an American, being from New York, I like things fast, and I use the word sclerotic at times, and I don't think I use this word, but I think there are other times when change should be measured. I certainly like things, I would like for things to have happened more quickly and evolved more quickly than they have. I thought the answer to the question that Connor asked about politically, when will this happen, is it does seem like the magnets are kind of, or the iron filings are aligning along the magnet. And I mean, timing is always a little tricky, but I mean, it seems as though the next 5 or 10 years, this seems like a logical thing to come together. I mean, it's kind of in the no-brainer category, which causes you to wonder why it hasn't happened. But again, I mean, systems change slowly. And anytime, final point here, anytime that I begin to become frustrated with organizations being slow to change, the church being slow to change, I ask myself the question, John, what is it about yourself that's hardest to change, and why haven't you changed it? So.
I couldn't improve on that. So I think we're going to have to call it an evening, but we really want to thank Professor Macy, Sister Gloria, and John. Thank you very much. And thank all of you.